Welcome to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amirault. I'm the marketing manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CanMed Conference. Speaking of the CanMed Conference, have you gotten your tickets yet for CanMed 2022? If yes, then I can't wait to see you out in Pasadena this May for another fantastic event. And if not, what are you waiting for? Head over to canmedevents.com now to get your tickets. At CanMed 2022, you will learn from the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. And if you want proof of that, look no further than our keynote presenters. Representing our science focus area, we have Dr. Ethan Rousseau presenting about cannabis and psychiatry. Representing our cultivation focus area, we have Dr. Seth Crawford talking about innovations in hemp breeding. Grace Bandong, our safety keynote presenter, will talk about building a comprehensive analytical testing program. And finally, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein will discuss cannabis medicine for children as our medical keynote. Those presentations alone are worth the price of admission, but please go to canmedevents.com to see the full schedule. And if you want a preview of what you can expect at CanMed 2022, check out our CanMed archive, which is a searchable video library of all the past CanMed presentations and panels. Find that at canmedevents.com. At this year's event, we are also offering a full-day pre-conference medical practicum taking place on May 3rd. The medical practicum is led by Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, Dr. Dustin Sulak, Dr. Kevin Spellman, and Eloise Thiessen. Each of them will share the latest medical cannabis research, including information on dosing, drug interactions, and different product types. They will also share their clinical experience they have acquired treating patients with medical cannabis. This really is a must-attend event for any healthcare professionals who are interested in recommending medical cannabis, but it's not limited to those folks. Anyone who is interested in learning more about medical cannabis can and should join us for this event. Head over to canmedevents.com/practicum to learn more. Of course, if you can't make it to CanMed 2022, we have a number of resources to help you stay engaged with our community and enjoy some world-class educational content. You are already off to a good start listening to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so new episodes download to your device automatically. Second, we have the CanMed archive that I mentioned earlier. It's a searchable video library of all the past CanMed presentations and panels that you can find at canmedevents.com. While you're at canmedevents.com, be sure to sign up for email alerts. That's the best way to make sure you are up to date on all the latest CanMed news and special offers. Fourth, we have our CanMed Community Facebook group, which is a great place to share and discuss news and topics related to cannabis science. The link to that group is in the show description. And finally, you can follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for CanMed Events. This episode, we are talking all about heavy metal testing with Robert Thomas. Robert is the principal of Scientific Solutions, a consulting company that serves the training, application, marketing, and writing needs of the trace element user community. He has worked in the field of atomic and mass spectrometry for more than 45 years, including 25 years for a manufacturer of atomic spectroscopic instrumentation. In recent years, Rob has become a prolific writer on the topic, with more than 100 technical publications to his name. In fact, he literally wrote the book on ICP-MS, the technology labs use to detect trace elements, and in his latest book, titled Measuring Heavy Metal Contaminants in Cannabis and Hemp, he applies his knowledge to the nascent cannabis and hemp testing space. In our conversation, we discuss what brought Rob to the cannabis and hemp industry, how heavy metal testing in the cannabis and hemp industry differs from the pharmaceutical industry, why cannabis and hemp are particularly susceptible to heavy metal contamination, the multiple sources of contamination throughout the cultivation and processing process, steps growers and producers can take to limit heavy metal contamination, and the current and future regulatory requirements for heavy metal testing. Before we get to my conversation with Rob, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, Pigment Tracker. The Pigment Tracker is a fluorescence spectrophotometer designed to allow cannabis processors and operators a way to quickly, accurately, and cheaply record the pigments in an extract or flower sample. Record keeping allows for more repeatable processing, which lowers the likelihood that batches will be rejected by clients or final consumers. For more information, check out Pigment Tracker's Instagram account. We've provided a link in the show description. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Robert Thomas. Good afternoon, Rob. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
You're welcome. I'm glad I could make it.
Okay, so you have decades of experience with heavy metal testing that you are now applying, or you're lending your expertise to the cannabis industry. So maybe a great place to start would be, tell us a bit about your background and what attracted you or got you started in the cannabis industry.
Sure. Yeah. I think to put it all into context, I think it's good to understand that I'm not from this industry, but I found the industry about 3 years ago, having worked 25 years for the PerkinElmer Corporation as an analytical chemist in the field of atomic and mass spectroscopy. I took one of the retirement packages a few years ago, and I ventured into the field of science writing. I always liked to write, and I think I was reasonably good at doing it. So I started looking around for opportunities. Fortunately, I had made a lot of good editorial contacts, and I started getting requests to write about trace element analysis. Probably the one thing that put me on the map with regard to trace element analysis publications was I did a 15-part series on ICP-MS for the journal Spectroscopy in the mid-2000s. That gave me a lot of visibility and a lot of exposure. It eventually led to a textbook on ICP-MS in the mid-2000s, and all of a sudden, I was getting visibility in a global sense because my book was sold all over the world. It was English, of course, but I was fortunate enough to get it translated into Mandarin and into Spanish. So that gave me additional visibility. At that time, I was asked to serve on the American Chemical Society Committee for Reagent Chemicals. I was asked to lead the Heavy Metals Task Force. So I came on board around about that time. And I was fortunate enough to be involved with helping United States Pharmacopoeia update their heavy metal testing procedure, which eventually came out in chapters 232 and 233. The ACS was an interested stakeholder with the USP, and we had both used a heavy metal test for almost 100 years, which was a colorimetric sulfide precipitation test, which was very crude and did not work correctly, and it was impacted by the experience of the analyst. So it was totally inappropriate, and it was only for a small group of metals, lead in particular. So USP were involved with changing that method because the pharmaceutical industry for so many years did not have an accurate test to actually quantify elemental impurities in pharmaceutical products. So with the FDA behind them, USP were tasked with coming out with brand new plasma spectrochemistry test methods to come out with an accurate and precise test for replacing that sulfide precipitation test. And at the ACS, we were also doing that because our book of compendial standards is a book that's recommended by USP in their USP NFL book. And we found that if we were going to change our method and USP were changing their method, it would be good to align them. So in fact, I was on many meetings with the USP, which discussed how would we change the method, what was important, and how we would go about the process of changing it. USP work very slowly. ACS does to a certain extent, but we managed to change our methodology from the sulfide precipitation test to ICP-OES and ICP-MS in a few years. Yet USP took in excess of 15 years to do that. It was frustrating, but we understood that at that time because they were trying to align the method with Europe and the rest of the world, and particularly to align it with ICH Q3D directives. So they took a long time. But in January 2018, they came out with a standardized method for both ICP OES and ICP-MS, together with elemental impurities for 24 heavy metals based on the method of delivery. So they came out in 2018. I had worked with them over a number of years up to that point, being the heavy metals leader of the task force at the ACS. So I saw an opportunity to really leverage that information which I've learned. And I was still going ahead with my writing. And I just felt that based on that, I presented to my publisher an opportunity for another book, which was Elemental Impurities in Pharmaceuticals. If you know textbook publishers, it takes a whole lot of proposals and justifications to get something approved. So it took a while, but eventually they agreed for me to go ahead and do that. So I gave them an outline. Took me, I used a lot of the material that I put together for my ICP-MS book. So it didn't take as long to actually put together a book on elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals. It took me another 12 months, but it helped having done a book. So in March of 2018, to coincide with the approval of USP chapters 232 and 233, I came out with my book, which was great for me because it put me on the map in the pharmaceutical industry. So that, again, gave me a lot of opportunities and a lot of more writing possibilities. However, at that time, I got to know the USP folks very well. They suggested that I should take a look at the cannabis industry because they felt that they were in need of help and they did not have a good understanding of heavy metal contaminants in the entire manufacturing process, from cultivation to processing to extraction to production to packaging to delivery. So I'm a little hesitant. I just finished a book, and as a writer of books, it consumes you for the time you're writing it. You really don't have time to do anything else. So I just finished my pharma book. So I was hesitant to really get involved, but I did. I started talking to some contact names they gave me. And I started realizing, wow, this is an industry that's exciting. It's fractured, it's chaotic, but what an opportunity. What an opportunity to make a difference. So I said, I've got to do this. So I went to my publisher again. I said, I would like you to consider another book. At that time, I had no outline for a book, but I just felt that the industry was primed for putting together an educational resource to help the industry understand this topic of heavy metal contaminants. So again, I had to write another proposal and justification. They agreed to it. That was about 2 years ago. It took me another year to put it together. Again, I used components from my pharma book and components from my ICP-MS book, and I just layered in a cannabis piece of the book. And I found that very interesting because I got a lot of input from the folks I just met in the cannabis industry, or folks that I'd connected with, because that first year I was just learning how the industry worked. Mm-hmm. And that's all I did, was to talk their jargon, to fully understand how it was working and how the dynamics between cultivators and processors and regulators and all the things that go with the industry. So anyway, I sat down and I wrote a proposal, wrote an outline, and eventually came out with a book, Heavy Metal Contaminants in Cannabis and Hemp, in December 2020. So that was over a year ago, but that kind of got me the visibility in the industry. All of a sudden, I was getting so many requests for writing, publishing, and speaking engagements. And that started my journey, which I'm still on the train. I still can't get off. It's very difficult to, the demand for my time is pretty crazy, but I relish that, I welcome it. And when I got a request to speak at CanMed, I said, I've got to do that. Unfortunately, I had to find funding for it. It took me 2 days to get funding for my travel. But I did. So I'm all signed up to talk at CanMed. So, and with that, you got involved, and Dad put me in contact with you, and this is where we are.
And here we are. No,
Yeah,
and we're
right.
and we're happy to have you. As you know, analytical testing or safety testing, it's one of our key focus areas for CanMed. So to have someone like you to give us information or share your knowledge around heavy metal testing, it's invaluable for sure.
That's
And
great. That's great.
so I wanted to ask you, so once you shifted from, pharmaceuticals to cannabis, in terms of heavy metal testing, what were some of the differences that you found, whether it's, in what heavy metals they're actually looking for, or techniques that they're using, or just sophistication of equipment? What were some of the things that you noticed?
Well, I think the first thing I noticed was that the pharmaceutical industry took 15 plus years to come out with comprehensive elemental impurities. So they had to go the whole process of carrying out a comprehensive risk assessment study of the industry based on the toxicity of the metals that are likely to be found somewhere in the manufacturing process, and doing a complete understanding of where those elemental impurities might occur and at what levels, and documenting them in something that the pharmaceutical industry could read and understand. And that is fully documented in ICH Q3D directives. And it goes through exactly how the pharmaceutical industry approached this. When I came into the cannabis industry, I started asking people, have you done a risk assessment of heavy metals in your products? And there was this blank stare or blank. It was like, what is a risk assessment study? So I had to come to grips with that clearly the cannabis industry were not flying by the seat of their pants, but they did not have a good understanding from cultivation to extraction to, everything involved. There are so many contact points, and I began to uncover those as I started getting information, as I started doing research of my own, but sometimes I was getting evasive answers from many people. The thing about the cannabis industry, some folks are not eager to share with someone who's just coming in trying to understand what's going on. That's unfortunate. But, I got some responses, but I did a lot of research on my own. And I found out there was no understanding of risk assessment with regard to heavy metals. And it was something that I felt strongly about. And one of the things I realized was when I was kind of on my own, I was someone coming into the industry with a lot of experience and knowledge in trace element analysis, but no one really knew me in the cannabis industry. So I thought, how can I get credibility? So what I did was I started working with organizations who I had worked with not so much in the past, but organizations I knew would have an impact on the cannabis industry, like AOAC, ASTM, NIST. So I started, and I'd had good contacts at these organizations. So I went to them and volunteered my time, obviously, and ASTM were eager to bring me in because they didn't really have any heavy metal expertise within the committees or subcommittees, people who were knowledgeable, but no one, if you like, with as much expertise as I had. So that was nice that they welcomed me in. And one of the first things that I recommended was I wanted to get together a workshop or a symposia which highlighted this, which brought this out into the public domain. Because to me, it wasn't in the public domain. It was in cannabis cultivators, processors, regulators. There was a little component of this, lots of people had, but it wasn't out there in the public domain. So I asked them if they would support me in a heavy metal workshop. This is a year ago now, and we talked about it. Again, I had to write a proposal, but I was used to writing proposals and justifications. So we eventually put together a workshop last summer, 3-day workshop. I was the chair, but supported by ASTM, and we got something like 22 abstracts in and 22 papers in, just specifically on heavy metals and whole aspects of heavy metals, from instrument vendors, from cultivators, from the whole industry, from academia, and that really brought it to the surface. So if you like, I think that's where the industry started saying, okay, so we need to do something. But things started moving very slowly. But that was the major difference between working in pharma and working in cannabis. With pharma, you had a highly regulated industry, and in cannabis, you have a highly unregulated industry. If you can call the states regulators, they are, but there's only so much they can do, and they don't have the knowledge and expertise to really regulate the industry in a meaningful way.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a symptom of the industry in general, right? Is that, you know, a lot of us, regulators, cultivators, everyone was sort of asked to run directly after legalization. And, industries like the pharmaceutical industry have had decades of experience and, well-regulated processes and everything that they've built upon, where we are just sort of not making up it as we go. We're doing the best that we can, but there's certainly more work to be done there. So I want to take a step back a bit and just talk about heavy metals in general. Like, what elements are we talking about here? What is their potential damage or effects that they could have on humans consuming them? And why in particular are cannabis and hemp sort of susceptible to contamination?
Okay. Well, we know that cannabis and hemp are really excellent phytoaccumulators. They will accumulate not so much heavy metals, but any elements that are in the soil or in the growing medium. They will attract it and absorb it, and it does not affect their health, and it does not affect their rate of growth. So for decades, they've been used as phytoremediators to clean up toxic waste sites. Chernobyl being one example of cleaning up heavy metals, radionuclides, and it's done a really good job of doing that. But there are other plants for doing that. The whole science of phytoremediation is a fascinating topic, and there are many plants that can do that. But fortunately or unfortunately, cannabis and hemp are one of the best phytoremediators, so they are used for that purpose. On the downside, a plant that's used for cannabinoids and other, the production of other things that we consume, really means that you have to be careful where you plant cannabis and hemp. Now, in the early days, the majority of the plants were grown indoors, whether hydroponically or in greenhouses indoors, where the growing conditions are far more stable. It's an environment which can be controlled, so you don't have the impact of weather, you don't have the impact of soil, or you don't have the impact of any contaminants that might be in an external growing medium. So that's the first point to emphasize. So if it's in the growing medium, it will be absorbed into the plant. It will get absorbed through the roots and stay in the leaves, the shoots, the stalks, the leaves, and eventually end up in the flowers. And there's a number of studies out there which show the ratio of how it's deposited in these different components of the plant. And that in itself is a fascinating fascinating way to look at it. But the thing is that some of the most toxic heavy metals, which we have as humans caused anthropogenically, we have contaminated much of the soil, and much of the contamination that we have given to our soil is based on using metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, which if you like, the repercussions of an industrial world where we're continually putting heavy metal contaminants out into the environment, whether it's from lead pipes, from water supplies, whether it's leaded gasoline, whether it's from lead in paint. So lead in particular, but mercury is another element that we've done very well of contaminating the environment. Power plants spew out 100 tons of mercury every year, and it goes on plants into the soil and into the aquatic systems. And unfortunately, once it gets into the aquatic systems, it gets converted to methyl mercury by the bottom feeders, and then it goes up the food chain. And that's why you've got to be careful when you eat fish like tuna or swordfish, which are predator fish, which will consume all the smaller fish, and it goes up the food chain. So as a result of that, the big four, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, are by far the most toxic, and by far the most of environmental concern. But it's not only those. There are other what are called heavy metals, although heavy metals is not a group in the periodic table. So when people say heavy metals, I ask them what they mean, because it could mean different elements to different people. But obviously, classically, the big four: lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. But elements like chromium, manganese, copper, nickel, iron, zinc. I mean, there are so many which can be quote unquote heavy metals. So we have to be aware of that. If they're in the soil, they will end up in the plant, and ultimately they will end up in the flower. And if they end up in the flower or anywhere in the biomass, and that biomass, you extract the cannabinoid, whatever the cannabinoid is, it will end up to some degree. And then as you process that through the system, depending on what process is used, you get concentration, you get purification, and you get additional elements brought into the equation, because it will absorb whatever it's in contact with, metal-wise, stainless steel, brass, anything. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but there's the whole thing about vaping devices, which has nothing to do with the production of cannabinoids, but it's the way they're delivered. And unfortunately, we have what are called vaping devices, which are, unfortunately, they are little devices which contain lots of metal components. And when you vape at elevated temperatures, never mind if there's nothing in the CBD extract or whatever the liquid is, you have the high potential of actually corroding the internal metal components and producing nanoparticles of that metal, which the consumer or the vapor will take into their lungs. That's a totally different subject, but it has to be brought into the equation. But the thing is that it's very difficult to eliminate any kind of metal from a plant that you grow outdoors. So you have to deal with that. How do you deal with it? How can you mitigate it? Can you mitigate it? If you can't mitigate it, how do you reduce the impact? So, yeah.
Excellent. And now, if I understand correctly, is this less of a concern with other crops because they're not as efficient as cannabis and hemp are in terms of accumulating these metals?
Yeah, I think it's a fact of life that hemp and cannabis are really good phytoremediators. They're really good at hyperaccumulating what's in the soil. But no, it's not. It's not. There's other plants which will absorb heavy metals, and some of those plants we consume. There's been a number of reports out, and I've reported on them, and I can certainly send you the information. But arsenic in rice. Arsenic is a big problem with rice because it's predominantly grown in flooded fields, and unfortunately, arsenic is a big component in soil. There's lots of arsenic in soil. So if rice is being grown in flooded fields, the arsenic gets into the water, and it gets extracted. It gets absorbed by the rice. And there's a study put out recently on arsenic in infant cereal.
Right.
And of course, infant cereal contains a lot of rice. And actually, Congress got hold of this report, and they went to the FDA and say, hey, what's going on? This is not acceptable. Because the FDA does not do a good job of regulating food in general for heavy metals, yet alone infant cereals. So yeah, there was a report recently of high levels of cadmium in chocolate.
Wow.
It gets into cocoa beans. It isn't only cannabis and hemp. It's a problem. As humans, we have contaminated the environment, and we have contaminated on a global scale. I read a report recently that up to 1/3 of arable land in the world is contaminated to some degree with heavy metals or some kind of metal contaminant. That's pretty scary when you consider if that translates to the US. So 1 field in 3 is contaminated. So this is what we have to deal with, and the industry is not doing a good job of understanding and dealing with that. And this is the area that I'm trying to bring exposure, visibility to the industry, that it's serious. And you're okay at the moment because the industry is moving so fast, so rapid, and it's growing so quickly with very little serious regulations. And at some point in time, the federal government are going to have oversight. And based on what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry, I think there could be some serious decisions to be made.
Right. You briefly touched on maybe some ways to kind of prevent getting heavy metals into your cannabis, whether it's making sure that the soil is free of heavy metals, or that if you're using, hydroponics, making sure that you have good water source. But I'm curious, if you know that you have cannabis material that is contaminated with heavy metals, is there any opportunity for remediation or removing them, or is it something that you can extract out? What can you do?
Yeah, it can be extracted out, but it's extremely expensive. I talked to someone fairly recently about that. Someone who had just grown a large batch of hemp. Actually, I can't remember where it was. I think it was in Colorado, but I can't remember. And they contacted me and asked me what are the opportunities to mitigate or reduce the heavy metal level in this plant. And there are ways of doing it. Extraction, for example, but they are extremely expensive. So I said, there's a chance, I don't know, but there's a chance that you might have to destroy that crop, which they didn't want to hear. But I hear of this all the time. And even though I can tell you that the industry is concerned about it, there are ways that they could reduce heavy metals by using higher purity nutrients, clean fertilizers, water that's been tested. Trust me, if you were growing hemp in, say, an area where they use leaded pipes, and you're using that supply of water, guaranteed there would be lead in the water supply, and guaranteed it would end up in the plant. So it's stuff like this. You've got to pay attention to what you're doing, and you've got to pay attention to how you can mitigate or reduce the level of heavy metals in the plant, eventually the flower. So there are ways of doing it, but I actually gave a talk at a analytical cannabis workshop the past couple of days, Wednesday and Thursday. And someone else who gave a talk before me was from Penn State, and he gave a talk actually on that problem of how do you reduce or how do you mitigate the transfer of heavy metals from the soil into the cannabis and hemp plant. It was a fascinating talk. And I hope there were people listening to that, because this is where we can have the biggest impact of getting clean cannabis and hemp is at the cultivation stage.
Excellent. Yeah. And, kind of before we went on that, you were talking about regulations, and I did want to ask you about that. So I know that heavy metal testing, well, first of all, regulation is very state dependent, as we know. So to your knowledge, what states are requiring heavy metal testing? And as we know, at least on our side from Medicinal Genomics, that the state to state requirements can vary vastly, where some can be sort of overly inclusive with too many things, and others can be drastically under inclusive. So in your opinion, which states are getting it right, or what do you think are the most important heavy metals that folks should be testing for?
Well, to start with, when states started regulating cannabis, and they came out with a list of 4 heavy metals, that was predominantly, they looked to the dietary supplements industry, and they looked to the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia, who only had the big 4 heavy metals on a list of heavy metals to monitor for dietary supplements and herbal products. So I can understand where they came from. However, what has happened as the industry and different states have come on board, they have been a little more proactive in trying to understand, well, what other heavy metals could be of concern. And a number of the states have increased that panel. New York, for example, has 9 on their list, the big 4, plus chromium, nickel, barium, zinc, selenium, and I think one other, zinc, yeah. But anyway, so they have 9. Maryland had selenium, silver, barium, and chromium, but they've recently dialed back on selenium, silver, and barium. I don't know why. So they have chromium in it, the big 4. Michigan has the big 4 plus copper, nickel, chromium, and inorganic arsenic. Now, Michigan are an anomaly. I don't understand because no other state has inorganic arsenic. So I'm trying to find out why Michigan decided to specify inorganic arsenic. So there doesn't to be any apparent reason why they do that, because I've talked to a state testing lab and they report total arsenic. So I just think that maybe state regulators don't understand the difference. I don't know. I'm not being unkind to them, but there's no reason why they should have done that.
Sure.
So I think some states are being proactive, and I've got involved with a number of states. Oregon, who had no heavy metals limits, put out for public comment their new regulations, and I sent my comments in together with a few of my publications to suggest that you should be monitoring maybe up to 15. I don't know whether they will do that, but at least I put it out. I put it to them in public comment. And Connecticut also were revising their heavy metals regulations and wanted public comment on that. So I sent those in as well. But what I tell state regulators, because I know a lot of state regulators, they kind of understand what I'm doing. I'm very sympathetic, but I think they understand that they don't want to be the first to expand the panel to say 15. So I think they're waiting for other states. But I keep reminding them, NIST have recently come out with a toxic metal certified reference material, which contains up to 13 elements. So I said, look, the NIST, they believe that NIST should be regulated more like tobacco than it should be, as it's being regulated at the moment. I serve on the ASTM committee, D37, and I'm on a number of subcommittees. One of them is the laboratory subcommittee, and we have just written a method for up to 21 elements in cannabis-related materials by ICP-MS. We're currently going through the review process now. So hopefully that'll come out in the next month or so. So really excited that ASTM are supporting me on this. So there will be up to 21 elements in that method. And also, which is brand new, USP have put out for public comment, they've posted a draft monograph for CBD to be used as an API. So this would be CBD to be used in a or a drug formulation. So you're talking about, Epidiolex or maybe other drugs that are going through FDA approval, which contain CBD. And in that draft proposal, they say that it must meet requirements of Chapter 232 for elemental impurities. Well, that's telling me that if they have that CBD monograph in their book of compendial standards to make CBD that's of the quality required for an FDA-based drug, they're going to have to be monitoring up to 24 elemental impurities. So this is telling me this is the way the industry is going, and I'm trying to get the cannabis industry on board to really think about this, because you don't want to be in a position where 1 year, 2 years down the road, FDA comes in and says, well, what's your list of elemental impurities? How many are you monitoring? Well, what's going on here? I mean, it obviously won't be as simple as that, but I'm telling you, based on my research, all the signs are that the elemental panel is going to be expanded. So,
yeah, wow. And so you mentioned all the different elements that folks should be monitoring. So I'm curious, what is like an acceptable limit for these elements? Does it differ for each elements? Are some sort of like pass fail where you don't want a trace of anything, or in others there's sort of a limit that's acceptable?
well, what the states are using is the PDE limits that were generated for drug compounds, drug substances. And this is described in ICH Q3D directives, where they spent 15 years to understand toxicity based on well-established animal models. So that information for pharmaceuticals is documented, and it's good data based on pharmaceutical delivery. But you got to understand that pharmaceuticals are delivered basically 4 different ways: orally, inhalation, intravenously, and transdermal. So there are 4 different categories for pharmaceuticals. As you can imagine, an inhalation has much lower PDE limits than, say, an oral delivered drug. But also remember that these are limits per day. So the way they define them in Chapter 232 and ICH Q3D directives is maximum limits per day. And to give you an example, if a pharmaceutical compound has a maximum delivery, maximum amount of 10 grams per day, you divide these daily maximum limits by 10, and you can come out with an approximation of what you need to have in your product. Well, that's great, because the pharmaceutical industry, is well used to defining, delivery amounts and mode of administration. The cannabis industry is not. So if you define 10 grams per day, what does that mean? Someone who's inhaling cannabis, someone who's eating a brownie, someone who's putting it on their arthritic finger. I mean, there are so many ways that cannabinoids are being delivered to consumers nowadays, and you can't say for certain that someone is only consuming X grams per day. And if you're basing your maximum allowable limits on a pharmaceutical guideline, which is based on a maximum dosage per day, you have to define a maximum dosage in your cannabis product, and they don't do that. They do not do that. And that's my critique of the way the regulations go, is that there's no logic to the way they define the regulations. But for example, many states, even though they lump every cannabinoid or every cannabis product into one mode of delivery, they'll say that it has to meet the inhalation PDEs. Well, work that out. There's no rhyme or reason why that should be the case. But because they're the lowest, they feel that if they can put the lowest levels, lowest maximum levels in their specifications for those product, if it's under those levels, the product has to be safe. Well, that's for want of a better word, that's a dumb way of regulating, cannabis products. So that's my other critique. Pharmaceutical PDEs are based on well-established animal models. They're based on delivery methods, and they're based on maximum dosages. Okay, cannabis, regulations, they don't take any of that into consideration.
So we talked a little bit about sort of the different sources of contamination that can introduce heavy metals into cannabis. We talked about from just growing the plant, whether it's accumulating it from the soil or the water. But I wanted to get into maybe post-harvest. What are some other ways that heavy metals could contaminate the plant?
Okay. Well, we know based on the extraction process that different amounts of heavy metal will be extracted into whatever you're making, broad spectrum, full spectrum isolates. And based on the extraction method, whether it's CO2, whether it's alcohol, whether it's butane, I mean, there are so many of them out there. There's definite, and there's information in the public domain which talks about you have to balance efficiency of the extraction method for producing cannabinoids, and I understand that, and extracting the minimum amount of heavy metals. So most extractors will obviously look for efficiency and not be so worried so much about are you extracting contaminants. But I always point to GW Pharmaceuticals, who have their extraction patent in the public domain. If you look at that, and it's complicated, but it explains it very nicely, that they balanced up the contaminants with efficiency of CBD, that ultimately they're making CBD to make drugs like Epidiolex. And they actually have another one going through the FDA pipeline, which is coming out soon. So they go for, less efficiency, but extracting less of the contaminants. The reason they can do that is their growing process is all indoors. All the cannabis that GW Pharma grows to make Epidiolex is grown indoors. So they're controlling the environment very, very strictly, controlling the watering, controlling the nutrient, the fertilizer, and everything. Clearly, many extractors in the US don't grow it indoors. So they're not looking at that extraction efficiency with regard to contaminants. So we know that there's probably more heavy metal contaminants coming through the extraction process, which could further down the processing chain, could be purified, could be concentrated. So you're always going to be dealing with that. So then you take it through the next step, and depending on what you're making, that's going to be in contact with things like stainless steel mixing vessels, maybe grinding equipment or whatever. I mean, there's so many different options here of what the product could be in contact with. But we know, based on research that's out there, and what I've uncovered, that, for example, it'll pick up chromium from a stainless steel cutting scissors, which is used to snip the buds. Yeah, really? Can you believe that? Yeah, that's true. And that surprised me. But certainly in mixing vessels, I mean, chromium, nickel, and iron are big components of stainless steel, obviously. And if you use a lot of stainless steel somewhere in the manufacturing process, your product will pick up one or more of those metals. And in addition to that,
that's got to be difficult, though. I mean, of course, us coming from the microbial side, right? I mean, one of the advantages of stainless steel is that it's pretty sterile. It's not going to be harboring microbial life as well.
Right.
But
right,
now you have something else you need to consider.
Yeah, again, I could point you to publications which have shown that, and I think it's important to understand that many times in the processing, in the chain of things you're doing in processing whatever you're making, it's not in contact with surfaces for long periods of time. But if it's stored in something, and this is a whole science of its own, is that liquids picking up impurities from storage vessels. And when I say storage vessels, I mean things like glass, things like plastic. We know, for example, that borosilicate glass, which is used a lot in the industry, is notorious for having high levels. Okay, not so much heavy metals, but transition metals. And some of those are heavy metals. So as an analytical chemist who uses glass in the process of analyzing anything for heavy metals, you learn you can never use borosilicate glass. You have to use either high purity borosilicate glass or quartz glass, because that's the purest. Because if you store any acids, any calibration standards in borosilicate glass, you'll get metals that are actually being leached out of the surface of the glass. So you tend to use high purity plastics, but not all plastics are high purity. So you've got to be careful the type of polymer or plastic that you use. There's an example recently where a testing lab in Florida was finding over time that CBD in graduated little dropper bottles was increasing in lead level from the time that the product was made to 2 to 3 months on the shelf. And what happened was that the graduated marks were made from lead-based ink. Wow. So what was happening was the lead was leaching out of the ink into the extract. And I'm not too sure what the extract was, but this testing lab was finding over extended periods of time of testing, it went from round about the regulated level, which was half a ppm, and in some cases, they were getting up to 50 times higher in the extract. Wow. So there's stuff like this that the industry, do they realize? I think some folks do. Are they doing anything about it? Not many. But there are so many points along the way where this could be happening. And then you get into delivery of the cannabinoid, where you talk, when you get into the vaping devices, which are becoming the delivery method of choice nowadays. And again, it's scary. It's scary to think what is happening, and the industry is not doing a good job of trying to understand that, because the process of knowing what's in the aerosol is very different to knowing what's in the liquid in the tank. Because the liquid in the tank is at room temperature. You start heating it, elevating the temperature, and then vaping it, because that in itself will draw out the heavy metals which are being corroded, and the vapor or the consumer will end up vaping small little particles of those heavy metals, not just the regulated big four, but we know based on a few studies out there, there's not many that are iron particles, that are chromium particles, that are lead particles, that are nickel particles. And that's because of the components inside these vaping devices, including lead-based solder. You would think that wouldn't be a problem, but now the industry is moving away from lead-based solder because initially it was a huge, huge problem. So whatever you're using, whether it's stainless steel, brass, nichrome, Cantal, there are so many different designs out there. When you start vaping at 200 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, you start corroding the inside of the components, and then it's anyone's guess how many you're getting through to the consumer.
Wow. So, I mean, I guess given that, maybe not so much that last example that you provided, though, but the fact that this contamination could happen kind of throughout the supply chain here, is it important that testing labs be testing sort of the final product for these impurities? Because I know that that's also very state dependent. Like, for example, California, that is a requirement. You have to do that. So your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've talked about this to many regulators because I'm trying to convince the regulator community, and there is a national association of regulators. I've forgotten what they're called, but the state regulator, or one of the state regulators from Maryland, is the chair of that group, and she talked at an AOAC meeting last week. And we talked about that. It was one of the questions I asked her. I said, I need to get the regulators to make them understand that this is something that they should be looking at seriously and being proactive in maybe trying to increase the number of elements in your state, because the elements that are not being measured are not being scrutinized. And we know, and I've talked again to many people about this, that cultivators are using things like nickel-based salts. They are flour. They produce larger flowers. Silicon-based salts, which make the shoot much sturdier. So there's stuff going on like that. But these elements are escaping the scrutiny of state regulators. They're not being regulated. So, and I'm not picking nickel and silicon out, for any other reason, but I know that these are used by cultivators. But you can argue that most of the nutrients and fertilizers that have been used are not high quality, and most of them are being made from phosphate-based fertilizers. Phosphate-based fertilizers are notorious for having high levels of heavy metals. So, it's anyone's guess what metals are being delivered from the nutrient and the fertilizer into the cannabis plant. So, yeah, I again, trying to get the attention of the industry, and regulators are one component. I've offered to give a talk to this. Are you familiar with this National Association of Regulators?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I followed up with an email to the person, and the talk was a lady called Laurie Dodson, who used to be a. Do you know Laurie?
The name does sound familiar.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I said, well, okay. So I asked her a question, which was a little bit unfair because she couldn't really answer it that well. But I said I would love to talk to your group about how maybe to be aware of the problem, to be aware that a lot of elements are not getting scrutinized, and I think that's impacting the consumer safety. I mean, I got to be careful what I say here, because I don't want to alarm the industry that all of a sudden that the industry is producing unsafe products. But I'm just trying to make them aware of research that I've done over the past 2 to 3 years, which has covered a lot in my book, but I followed up with publications and public speaking engagements. I just think the industry should be more aware of this. That's all.
Well, then it's a great thing that you're coming to CanMed this year, because we're attracting folks from all over the industry, and you'll definitely have a platform to share this information.
I think that's why I wanted to accept the invitation. It's probably a 3 or 4 day trip for me, but again, you have to justify your time and your expenses, but I think it's well worth it, definitely.
Excellent. All right. Before I let you go, Rob, I do want to give you a chance to share any additional resources with the audience that they can learn more about your work, or the topic in general. If you let me know, I can put the links into the show description so that they can learn more.
Yeah, would you mind if I give you a link to my book, for example?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and let me give you links to a couple of my sort of more recent publications, and that will give the audience, I think, a better understanding of where we are at the moment.
Excellent. And I encourage any listeners to come out to CanMed as well and listen to Rob's talk.
Of course. Yeah, please. You could talk to me personally then.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again, Rob. And
Okay,
I
Ben.
can't wait to see you out in Pasadena for CanMed.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Robert Thomas. Check out the links in the show description to learn more about the topics we discussed. And thanks again to our sponsor, Pigment Tracker. Our next episode will drop April 13th. That's 2 weeks from today. In the meantime, please do check out the CanMed archive and join the CanMed community Facebook group to stay connected with us. Of course, you can also stay in touch with us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Just search for CanMed Events. Sign up for email alerts on canmedevents.com to stay up to date with all the latest news. And please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Doing so helps us reach more listeners. I do sincerely hope to see all of you out in Pasadena this spring, but until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and please join us for the next CanMed Coffee Talk.